Hi guys, Mr. Stevens here. We're going to jump right back into Son of the Morning Star, Custer and the Little Bighorn by Evan S. Connell. We'll pick up right where we left off. When asked how the Sioux felt about being forcibly transported from one reservation to another, he suggested that one act with a little consideration for the Indians' feelings, just as with other people. Quote, I am a Southerner, and I have noticed that you may take a Negro far from home, but he will always have an inclination to return. The same feeling actuates the salmon. The court eventually decided that Reno had been opposed by such overwhelming force that any deeper penetration into the hostile village would have brought about the annihilation of his command. While his subordinates may, in some instances, have accomplished more for the safety of all concerned, quote, there was nothing in his conduct which requires animadversion from this court. Such a verdict suggests that his decision to retreat was based on a rational understanding of the situation. Perhaps this is true. To a degree, undoubtedly it is true, but after they had withdrawn into the cottonwoods near the river, he began talking with Custer's favorite Indian scout, Bloody Knife. He was trying to find out what the hostiles might do when a bullet struck Bloody Knife in the head and splattered his brainson on Reno's face. Some historians believe the shock of this left him psychologically paralyzed. Perhaps. But Reno saw gobbets of blood during the Civil War and may very well have been spattered numerous times. Accordingly, one may speculate. At the time of this grotesque incident, Bloody Knife was wearing, along with his distinctive clamshell bear claw necklace, a black neckerchief with blue stars which Custer had given him. He was, therefore, emblematic of command, and when he collapsed it may be that Reno perceived the future. All one can say with certainty is that the Major was shocked. How deeply and for how long, nobody knows. He lost his straw hat in the timber, he said, although he did not say just when. Quite possibly he threw it away at this moment. A blood-soaked shirt or trousers may be endured, but a bloody hat hangs close to the face. Major Reno's conduct, whether he behaved rationally or was too frightened to think, has been argued for a century. He had been a good Civil War record, twice decorated for gallantry, but this was his first experience with Indians, who did not behave at all like Confederates. Boiling dust, an alien landscape, arrows thumping into flesh, it made less sense than a premeditated cavalry charge in Virginia. 4 horses bolted out of formation, carrying their desperate riders to the Sioux. 2 of these men regained control and got back. The other 2, Privates George Smith and James Turley, rode on into Unkpapa village where they were caught, dragged from the saddle, stabbed, beaten, chopped up. A nephew of Sitting Bull, Henry Oscar One Bull, saw the horses break out of line, and when interviewed many years later, he remarked with satisfaction, quote, these soldiers didn't last long. Private Morris thought Turley was killed someplace else, but there seems to be little doubt that the Unkpapa villages got Smith. The head of a white man, possibly Smith, was found on the abandoned site of the village. Whoever he was, he had been dragged at the end of a rope until he fell apart. Henry One Bull said the bluecoats were confused. Some jumped off their horses and scampered toward the cottonwood beside the river, and turning around and shooting while they ran. He rode up behind one of them, knocked him down with a stone-headed club, and held him under water until he quit struggling. Black Elk and Oglala claimed to have been 13 years old at the time. He looked like a child because he was not very robust, but already he had experienced a vision and had performed a number of various deeds, so by the white man's count, he might have been older. He talked about the dust raised by the ponies' hooves, the smoke, the cries, the gunfire, the shriek of the eaglebone whistles, the women singing to encourage their husbands and sons, and he remembered big American horses galloping through the dust with empty saddles. Quote, those Washus had come to kill our fathers and mothers and us, he said, using a Sioux term which implies an unwelcome or disagreeable persistence, and it was our country. He and several other boys surrounded a soldier who were hiding in a clump of mulberry bushes. The soldier tried to escape, crawling this way and that, while the boys ran around shooting arrows at him. Black Elk said it was like hunting a rabbit. They knew they hit him at least once because he yelped. After a while they set fire to the grass, which brought him out of the bushes, and some warriors killed him. Black Elk himself scalped the soldier who was still alive. It was hard work because the soldier's hair was short and the knife was dull. The soldier ground his teeth and made such a fuss that Black Elk had to shoot him in the head. After finishing the job, he wanted his mother to know about the scalp, so he rode over to a crowd of women and children who had gathered up on a hill to watch the fight, and when his mother saw the trophy, she uttered a shrill tremolo in his honor. To Reno's soldiers, trapped in the cottonwoods, a valley swarming with naked, yipping, barking, fantastically painted aborigines must have resembled a 19th century illustration of Dante's Hell, and what should have been a disciplined withdrawal from this position turned into a rout with Major Reno himself leading the way, deserting those who were unable to follow or who did not understand what was happening. It has been alleged that after emptying his revolver, he became so distraught that he tossed it aside, although this was never proved. His eagerness to escape from the valley might be traced to an unpleasant Civil War experience. In the spring of 1865, his regiment was chasing a Confederate guerrilla known as Gray Ghost, John Singleton Mosby, chasing him with very little success until one day they came upon Mosby chatting with a few men in the village of Hamilton. Delighted by such good luck, Reno spurred forward and the Gray Ghost fled in a panic up the road to Middleburg. Then, from the woods alongside Middleburg Road came a fusillade of bullets. 21 of Reno's men dropped from the saddle. Now the major might not have been brilliant, yet neither was he stupid, so it is a fair assumption that he did not forget the Gray Ghost's murderous trap. 11 years later, in the Little Bighorn Valley, he had once again charged an apparently vulnerable enemy, only to be surprised by the response. A sudden recollection of that mistake in Virginia might have sucked his courage, or, as Napoleon is supposed to have said, "Show me a man who makes the same mistake twice, and I will show you a fool." During this retreat from the cottonwoods to the bluffs across the river, the Indians very often shot at the cavalrymen's horses, which at first sounds illogical, considering how highly the Indians valued horses. But a horse is a big target, and if it went down, or was crippled, the rider had no chance to escape. This inference was drawn by General Terry's command while marching through the valley because his troops noticed that the body of a cavalryman almost always lay beside the carcass of a horse. Squaws, children, and old men rushed out of the village as soon as the blue coats fled, stripping, robbing, mutilating, killing those who still twitched. Bloody Knife's head was cut off, perhaps by one of the Inkpaduta's Santee Sioux, because the Santees were the only tribe that habitually practiced decapitation instead of scalping. There is another possibility. By some accounts, 2 young Unkpapa sisters were the first to see Bloody Knife's corpse. They did not know who he was, but from his clothing they knew he had been a scout for the soldiers, and his graying hair was parted on the side, which identified him as a Ree instead of a Crow, whose men usually cut their hair short in front and combed the rest into a ruff or pompadour. So the girls cut off the bullet-smashed head of this middle-aged Ree and went back to camp with it swinging between them like a ball, each sister holding on to one of the dusty braids. In the village they mounted their trophy on a stick. Bloody Knife was well known to adult Sioux. Although his mother was Ree, his father had been Sioux, and the first 15 or 16 years of his life were spent among his father's people. Those years were difficult, perhaps because of his mixed blood. At times, the Sioux and the Ree got along all right if they felt like trading, but ordinarily they did not, and the Sioux spoke of the Rees with contempt as corn-eaters. Sanish was what the Rees called themselves. Mandan neighbors along the upper Missouri called them Panis because they were related to the Skeety Pawnees, when the name by which they are best known was Arikara, antlers, because in the old days they arranged their hair around 2 bones projecting from the head like horns or antlers. Early in the 19th century, when Lewis and Clark visited the Rees, they were friendly. Quote, but owing to the system of the trade, said the artist George Catlin, who saw them a generation later, they have been inflicted with abuses, for which they are harboring the most invertebrate feelings toward the whole civilized race. Joshua Pilcher, who managed a fur trading post in 1823, said they were notorious for treachery and barbarity, and had murdered more people than all of the other tribes combined. The Sioux also behaved with great friendliness at first from the days of their meeting with Lewis and Clark until sometime after the California Gold Rush. One 49er remarked that without their help in fending off the Pawnees, Cheyennes, and Arapos, no white man could have gotten through without an army. As to just when and why the Sioux began to feel differently, there is no simple answer. Senator Thomas Hart Benton blamed the War Department, telling his colleagues in Washington that the brass hats dispatched, quote, schoolhouse officers and pothouse soldiers to treat the Indians as beasts and dogs. Whatever the causes, American response to Aboriginal treachery and barbarity was devastating, although inadvertent. On June 20th, 1837, the steamboat St. Peter's unloaded at Fort Clark, delivering goods the Indians cherished along with something unexpected. A Mandan stole a blanket contaminated by smallpox, which started the plague in that area, and upriver at Fort Union, the Indians refused to disperse, even after being warned away from the boats by whites who now understood the danger. They refused to leave because they assumed that once more they were about to be swindled. Jacob Halsey, in charge of the Fort Union Depot, thought the best thing to do was to vaccinate everybody, and he is said to have been surprised when a number of his subjects began vomiting, bleeding, and dying. Halsey himself caught the pox. He got over it, but his Indian wife did not. And we will end there for the day. We are going to come back and read Son of the Morning Star in the next video, so I hope you guys are still enjoying it. We will see you soon. Bye, guys.